The soft chime of a bell echoed as Natasha Griffin pushed open the weathered cafe door. The air inside carried a familiar blend of roasted beans, warm pastries, and memories she thought she had buried 10 years ago. It had been a decade since she last walked down this quiet street, 10 years since the girl from a struggling neighborhood became the woman who owned a skyline. Now, at 32, Natasha was the celebrated CEO of Eden Media, a name whispered in boardrooms and printed across magazines. Her life was a montage of jet flight's investors and applause all polished to perfection. But today, none of it mattered. Today, she just wanted to feel something real again. She brushed a raindrop from her cheek, straightened her dark wool coat, and looked around. The cafe hadn't changed much, same honey-colored wooden tables, same crack in the far left window pane, same soft jazz, playing from the old radio. The same place she had spent countless hours with the boy who once promised her forever. Then she saw him. At a table by the window, a man was helping a little girl draw. His hands, strong, careful, guided hers across a paper napkin. His hair was darker now, touched with silver at the temples. His jawline was rougher, his shoulders broader. He wore an old flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, a man built by work, not wealth. And when he laughed softly at something, the girl said, she froze. That laugh, that voice. Charles, she whispered almost to herself. He looked up and time folded. His blue eyes met hers across the cafe, and for a long, trembling heartbeat, the world went silent. The years, the distance, the success, all of it vanished. His lips parted in disbelief. Natasha, is that really you? Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something clever, something confident, the kind of line a CEO would deliver. But all she managed was a shaky smile. It's me, she said quietly, after all these years. The little girl, maybe 4, with curls, the color of chestnut honey, looked up curiously. Daddy, you know her? Charles blinked. Yeah, sweetheart, I think I do. They sat together, almost afraid to speak too loudly, as if words might break the fragile magic of that moment. Natasha noticed the lines on Charles's face, the tiredness around his eyes. She had imagined this reunion 1,000 times in a gala, a charity event somewhere with crystal lights and champagne. Never like this. Never with him sitting across from her in a cafe, wearing an oil-stained watch and crayon marks on his sleeve. And yet, there was something grounding about it, something heartbreakingly human. They spoke cautiously, as though rediscovering the language of an old love. He told her he worked at a small auto garage nearby, that his wife had passed away years ago, and that the little girl Rosie was his whole world. She told him she ran a company now, though she didn't say how large or how famous. Success suddenly felt meaningless, sitting across from the man who once made her laugh through finals week with cheap coffee and dreams. There was silence for a while, a silence that said more than words. 10 years, he murmured, looking down at his hands. I thought I'd never see you again. I didn't want to leave, she said softly. After Mom died, the family that adopted me, they sent me away. I had no choice. I waited, he whispered, for months. I thought maybe you'd come back. I tried to write, she confessed, voice trembling. They never sent the letters. They both looked away, blinking back the ghosts of their youth. Outside, the city lights shimmered in puddles on the street. Inside, the cafe hummed quietly, the clink of a spoon, the faint hiss of the espresso machine, the kind of background music that accompanies heartbreak. Rosie began humming a tune under her breath, drawing a family 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small, and one with curly hair. Natasha's heart clenched. Is that your mom? She asked gently. Rosie shrugged. I don't have one. Daddy says she's in heaven. Then she smiled, bright and guileless. But maybe she's watching us right now. Natasha swallowed hard. I think she is. As Charles packed up Rosie's crayons, Natasha stood by the door, unsure if she should leave or stay. Then he said almost shyly, There's a garage down on Lincoln Street. I work there most days, if you ever need your car checked. She smiled faintly. I just might. And for the first time in 10 years, she felt something stir, not the thrill of success or ambition, but the quiet ache of a story left unfinished. As she stepped into the cold evening air, rain began to fall again. She looked back once through the glass. She could still see Charles, helping Rosie with her coat. A father gentle and patient, a man who once gave her his heart, and maybe still held a piece of hers. But here's the twist. What neither of them knew was that the small auto garage Charles owned was being secretly funded by the Carter Foundation, a philanthropic branch of Eden Media, Natasha's company. The charity project she had approved last year to support small businesses run by single parents, Charles was its first recipient. Without ever knowing, they had been helping each other survive. Two lives once torn apart, now quietly orbiting the same circle of grace. Sometimes love doesn't vanish. It just waits for the right moment to be seen again. If you've ever wondered whether second chances are real, maybe this story is your answer. Because love, even after 10 years, still knows the way home. The next morning, Natasha couldn't stop replaying that moment in her mind, the sound of Charles's voice, the way his eyes had softened when he saw her. 10 years had passed, yet somehow it felt like no time at all. She had meant to return to New York that evening, to her penthouse, and her schedule packed with meetings. But her car stayed parked in front of the small inn where she was staying. She told herself she just needed another day of quiet. The truth was simpler. She couldn't leave. Not yet. Later that afternoon, she found herself back at the cafe. The same soft hum of jazz, the same smell of ground coffee beans, the same wooden table by the window where Charles and his daughter had sat. He was there again. Rosie was coloring tongue pressed between her lips in deep concentration. Charles was sipping coffee, reading the newspaper with one hand, while steadying the crayons with the other. He noticed her almost immediately. Surprise flickered across his face, then softened into a smile. Didn't expect to see you here twice in 1 week, he said. Neither did I. Natasha replied, her own smile trembling at the corners. Guess I needed another cup of small-town coffee. He chuckled. Still too bitter. Still too bitter, she said, meeting his gaze. But maybe that's what makes it real. They talked at first about little things. The cafe owner, the weather, the way Rosie had drawn an entire page of rainbows because she'd seen one that morning. Then the conversation drifted toward the past, like a tide they could no longer hold back. Charles set his cup down. I used to come here every Sunday, you know, after you left. Her breath caught. You did. He nodded slowly, sat at that same table, kept thinking you'd walk in one day, maybe with that green backpack you used to carry. A sad smile tugged at her lips. It fell apart years ago. So did I, he said softly. The words hit harder than she expected. She looked away, blinking fast. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. I tried to write Charles. Every week at first, then every month. Letters I never knew if you got. His brow furrowed. Letters. They never told you, she whispered. My guardians, the family that sponsored me, they intercepted everything, said my old life would hold me back. I begged to send one last note, but they destroyed them. For a moment he said nothing, only silence, stretched between them, the kind that aches. Finally, he exhaled, eyes glistening. All those years, I thought you forgot. I checked the mailbox every day. Then I stopped. Her fingers tightened around her cup. I never forgot. Not one day. Just then, a soft clatter broke the moment. Rosie's box of crayons had spilled tiny colors rolling across the wooden floor. Instinctively, Natasha knelt to help her. Their hands met his, rough from labor, hers, smooth from office work, and in that brief touch, 10 years of distance vanished. Their eyes lifted at the same time, and for one fragile heartbeat, it felt as if the universe exhaled. Rosie giggled, unaware of the weight in the air. "Thank you, Miss Natasha," she chirped, gathering her crayons. Natasha smiled gently. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Charles's voice was quiet. "She likes you. I like her too." Natasha said, her tone soft, but full of something she couldn't name. "She reminds me of light." He looked at her with that same steady warmth he'd always had. "She's been my light for a long time." Outside, the afternoon turned golden. Sunlight spilled through the window, painting their faces in the same soft glow that had once fallen over library tables and late-night study sessions. Natasha studied him, the way time had shaped his features, deepened his expression, but never dulled his gentleness. She wondered how many storms he'd faced alone, how many nights he'd tucked Rosie into bed, whispering stories no one told him. She thought about her own nights in hotel rooms overlooking skyscrapers, where silence echoed louder than applause. Success had filled every space in her life, except the one that mattered most. Charles rose to leave, packing Rosie's things. "We should head home before dinner," he said. Natasha nodded, trying to sound casual. "Of course." But as they stood at the door, neither seemed able to say goodbye. He hesitated, then added quietly, "You know, I thought life was done, surprising me. Then I saw you walk through that door." She smiled through the ache. "Maybe life isn't done giving us second chances." His expression softened, but he said nothing, only nodded, then took Rosie's hand and stepped into the light rain that had started to fall. Natasha stayed behind, watching them through the window, the way Rosie's tiny hand fit perfectly into her father's, the way Charles bent down to shield her from the drizzle. They looked like a picture of something she had once dreamed of, something she had lost before she even knew how to hold it. When she finally stepped outside, the air smelled of rain and baked bread. She slipped a folded napkin into her purse, the one Rosie had been coloring on earlier. 3 stick figures smiling beneath a crooked sun. One of them had golden curls. The other had dark skin and bright eyes, and between them, a small girl with a pink dress and a heart floating above her head. In shaky, uneven letters, Rosie had written, "Me and Daddy and Miss Natasha." That night in her hotel room, Natasha sat by the window as raindrops slid down the glass. She unfolded the napkin again and traced the little heart with her finger. She had built a life of power, yet here she was, undone by a child's drawing and a man's quiet kindness. For the first time in years, she wished she could write a letter. Not one for business or diplomacy. Just a letter that said, "I still remember the sound of your laugh. I still remember the smell of coffee. That morning, we dreamed about the future. And I never stopped loving you, Charles, not even once." But this time, she didn't need to send it. Because for the first time, she believed somehow it would find its way to him anyway. It took Natasha nearly an hour to find the small garage on Lincoln Street. The old woman at the cafe had said, "There's a kind man who fixes cars for half the price. Works harder than most folks I know." The rain from the night before had dried, leaving the air clean and sharp. Natasha's heels clicked against the cracked sidewalk as she approached the building. A faded sign swung above the doorway. Carter Auto Repairs. The paint was peeling, but the letters still stood proud, as though time hadn't yet won. When she pushed open the door, a bell jingled weakly. The smell of oil and rubber filled the air, the scent of labor of hands that built and mended. Charles was there, half hidden beneath the hood of a pickup truck, sleeves rolled a wrench in hand. The sunlight caught in his hair, dusted with silver, and for a moment, Natasha simply stood watching him work the quiet rhythm of someone who fixed things for a living, perhaps because life had broken too much. He straightened when he heard her steps. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by that familiar warmth. Natasha. She smiled a little uncertainly. Hope I'm not interrupting. Never. He said, wiping his hands on a rag. But this is the last place I expected to see you. I was nearby. She lied gently, though she wasn't sure why she still felt the need to hide the truth that she had come here for him. In the corner of the garage, a small girl sat cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered across a piece of cardboard. Rosie looked up, her curls framing her round cheeks. "Hi, Miss Natasha," she said brightly. Natasha knelt beside her. "Hi, sweetheart. What are you drawing today?" "A family," Rosie replied proudly, showing the paper. 3 stick figures smiled under a lopsided sun. Above them, in clumsy letters, she had written, "Mommy, Daddy." Me, Natasha's breath caught. The drawing was so innocent, so full of longing, it hurt to look at. Charles noticed her expression and gave a quiet, weary smile. "She draws that a lot," he said softly. "I tell her her mommy's an angel now, but she says angels don't eat pancakes with you." Natasha laughed lightly, though her chest ached. "She sounds like a very wise little girl." "She's everything," Charles said, simply. Natasha reached into the small paper bag she carried. "I brought something," she said. Rosie's eyes widened when she saw the cupcakes, small golden, each topped with a swirl of frosting and a tiny sugar bear. "For me," Rosie gasped. "For you." Natasha smiled. The little girl clapped her hands, then asked with that unfiltered curiosity only children have, "Can you be my mommy?" For one day, the world seemed to still. Charles froze, the rag slipping from his hand. Natasha blinked rapidly, her heart twisting. She tried to smile, but her voice broke as she whispered, "Sweetheart, that's a big question." Rosie tilted her head, confused. "But you're nice, and you smell like cookies." Natasha let out a trembling laugh that was half sob. "Well, I'd be honored to spend the day with you, if your daddy doesn't mind." Charles's voice was quiet. "I think she'd like that very much." That afternoon became a soft, accidental miracle. While Charles finished work, Natasha and Rosie sat in the sun outside the garage. Rosie told stories about her stuffed bear, about how she wanted to be an astronaut who baked cupcakes in space. Natasha listened as if hearing poetry. She tied the girl's curls with a ribbon from her own hair, helped her color flowers, and laughed a real laugh, one she hadn't felt in years. When Charles finally came out wiping his hands, he paused at the sight before him. Natasha sitting cross-legged on the pavement, frosting on her fingers. Rosie in her lap, giggling uncontrollably. Something inside him, something long buried, stirred. "Sorry," Natasha said, noticing his look. "We might have made a small mess." He smiled faintly. "It's the best mess I've seen in a long time." The 3 of them shared dinner that evening. Simple sandwiches from the shop next door, eaten on overturned paint buckets. The laughter came easily, and for the first time in a decade, Natasha felt what peace might sound like. As the sky turned amber, Rosie fell asleep in her father's arms. He tucked her in the back seat of the old car blanket, wrapped tight. "She must have tired you out," he said quietly. Natasha looked at the sleeping child, then at him. "No," she said softly. She reminded me what it's like to breathe. Before leaving, she hesitated by the door. Charles, I know this sounds strange, but could I come by again sometime? I've been thinking about expanding my company's community outreach. Maybe we could partner with small businesses like yours. He frowned, slightly suspicious of pity. You don't have to do that. I want to, she said, meeting his eyes. You work hard. You deserve support. After a pause, he nodded. All right, but only if you promise you're doing it because you want to, not because you feel sorry for me. She smiled. I promise. Over the next few weeks, she found reasons to visit Lincoln Street, some legitimate, some fabricated. Checking progress on the funding paperwork, she'd say. Or just passing through. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't there for business. She was there for him, for the quiet steadiness of his voice, for the warmth that filled the air when Rosie laughed, for the glimpse of the life she had once dreamed of before money and ambition rewrote her story. Sometimes she'd bring pastries, sometimes crayons. Sometimes she'd just sit nearby and watch Charles work, hands steady, face peaceful. The world beyond that garage, the endless meetings, the glittering skyline began to feel distant, almost unreal. Here, in the dim light of a small repair shop, life was imperfect, but honest. And for a woman who had spent years chasing perfection, honesty felt like the rarest luxury of all. That night, as she drove away from Lincoln Street, she caught sight of the garage's sign in her rearview mirror, its paint, chipped, its letters, fading yet somehow still standing firm against time. It reminded her of someone she once loved, of someone she might still love. And for the first time since her return, Natasha whispered to the empty car, maybe I was never meant to forget you. Charles. The phone rang just after midnight. Natasha Charles's voice was strained, roughened by worry. I'm sorry to call. Rosie's burning up. The clinic's closed and I can't. I'm coming, she said before he could finish. Within minutes, she was out the door, raincoat pulled tight, headlights cutting through the misty road. She found them in the tiny apartment, Rosie lying on a couch too small for comfort. Cheeks flushed with fever, Charles kneeling beside her with a cold cloth trembling in his hand. Hey, sweetheart, Natasha whispered, kneeling beside the child. You're okay now. I promise. She felt Rosie's forehead burning. Without hesitation, she took control, called her private doctor, gathered her things, and within the hour, had both father and daughter in her car. Charles started to protest, but his voice faltered under exhaustion. I can't ask you to. You're not asking, she said firmly. I'm telling you. You're coming with me. Her house sat on the edge of the countryside just outside the city, a modest home with ivy climbing up its white walls, and a garden that smelled of mint and rain. For years, it had been more of a weekend retreat, a place to escape meetings and headlines. Now it felt like something entirely new, a refuge. The doctor arrived soon after. A mild infection, she said, rest fluids care. Nothing more serious. By dawn, Rosie's fever broke. The child slept soundly in Natasha's guest room, small hands curled around a stuffed bear. Charles sat by the window, head in his hands. Natasha brought him tea. You need rest too, she said softly. He shook his head. I'll stay here, just in case she wakes up. She hesitated, then laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. Then at least, sit down before you fall over. For the first time, he smiled, faint but real. What began as a few days turned quietly into a few weeks. Each morning, Charles rose early, making breakfast in her sunny kitchen. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted through the house before Natasha even woke. When she came downstairs, still in her robe, he'd look up from the stove and say, half teasing, You're the only person I've ever met who can make $1 million deal before brushing her hair. And you're the only person who still uses instant coffee in 2025. She'd reply, smiling. He'd shrug. It's tradition. By noon, Rosie would be out in the garden chasing butterflies, picking dandelions, talking to the tulips, as if they were old friends. Natasha would watch from her office window, fingers paused on her laptop keys. Each laugh from that little girl was like sunlight through stained glass. Sometimes she'd go outside barefoot in the grass and help Rosie weave flower crowns. Sometimes Charles would join them, kneeling beside the flower beds, his hands deep in soil. He began repairing her garden bit by bit, trimming the hedges, mending the fence, reviving what had long been neglected. What had once been a wild tangle of weeds slowly turned into rows of color lilies, lavender daisies. Didn't know you were a gardener, Natasha said one morning. I'm not, he replied, wiping sweat from his brow. But I know how to fix things that have been left too long. The words lingered in the air between them. Evenings became their quiet ritual. Dinner laughter and stories by the fireplace. Rosie would curl up between them with her storybooks. Natasha would read first, her voice soft and melodic. Charles would take over halfway through, adding sound effects and silly voices, until Rosie's laughter filled the room. Sometimes when the little girl drifted to sleep, Natasha and Charles would just sit in silence, the fire-crackling shadows dancing across the walls. There were no grand gestures, no confessions. Only the simple comfort of presence. A man, a woman, and a child, breathing in rhythm. One afternoon, while hanging laundry outside, Natasha heard the neighbor's voice over the fence. Well, if that isn't the sweetest little family I've seen all summer, the elderly woman said with a grin. You three look like you belong in a postcard. Natasha felt warmth rush to her cheeks. We're not exactly a family, she said quickly. The neighbor winked. Could have fooled me. When Natasha turned back, Charles was standing by the porch arms, crossed, a half smile tugging at his lips. You heard that, didn't you? She asked. He nodded. Yeah. Guess I didn't mind the sound of it. She froze, unsure how to answer. Then she looked away, pretending to fuss with the laundry, though her hands trembled slightly. The air between them thickened, not with awkwardness, but with something tender and fragile, like the moment before rain. That night, as she closed her laptop after another late call, Natasha glanced through the glass doors leading to the garden. Charles was outside, crouched by the flower beds, his face lit by the soft glow of porch light. He was tying back a row of wild daisies, battered by the wind. His movements were slow, careful, almost reverent. And watching him there, the man who had once held her hand through exams, who now fixed her broken garden without being asked something inside, her quietly bloomed. It wasn't the dizzy rush of young love. It was deeper, steadier, the kind of love that grows from kindness, patience, and second chances. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the faint hum of life on the other side. In the reflection, she saw herself not the CEO in a designer suit, but a woman standing in the half-light, rediscovering what it meant to care. When she finally stepped outside, he looked up, surprised. You should be resting, he said softly. So should you, she replied, but I see you're too stubborn for that. He smiled faintly. Maybe I just don't like leaving things half-finished. They stood there, the cool night air, carrying the scent of wet soil and jasmine. Somewhere in the distance, a train hummed faintly. Rosie's laughter from earlier still seemed to linger in the garden like an echo of joy. Natasha looked at Charles, her heart steady but full. And though no words were spoken, something passed between them, something quiet, true, and unhurried. A promise not yet said aloud, but already understood. Tin yu kung kan loi. It had already found its way into the spaces between their breaths. The summer days stretched quietly after that. What had begun as something warm and easy laughter over dinner, lazy afternoons in the garden, slowly began to shift. Natasha felt it first in small ways. Charles's laughter faded sooner, his eyes wandered longer. His goodnight hugs grew shorter. The closeness they had built, so natural, so tender, started to feel like a memory instead of a moment. At first, she told herself it was exhaustion. He was working long hours helping at the garage, while still tending to the repairs around her house. But as the days passed, the silence between them deepened, heavy, unsaid, painful. She found him one morning at the kitchen sink, staring out the window where Rosie played in the grass. The coffee had gone cold in his hands. "You've been quiet lately," she said gently. He didn't look at her. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how strange it feels to be here," he said finally, turning to meet her gaze. "This house, the space, the quiet, it's all more than I belong to." Natasha frowned. "Charles, don't say that. You and Rosie?" He shook his head, setting the mug down. "You built a world I could never walk into, Natasha." "Not really. You wake up to phone calls and conferences. I wake up to engines and oil stains." She crossed her arms, her voice soft but firm. "And yet somehow we meet right here in the middle." He gave a small, sad smile. "For now, maybe." The next days unfolded with a strange tension, polite, careful, as if both were afraid to breathe too deeply. When Natasha worked in her study, Charles stayed longer at the garage. When she made dinner, he claimed he'd already eaten. When Rosie asked for bedtime stories, he sent Natasha instead. The house that had felt like home began to feel like something borrowed. One evening after Rosie had gone to bed, Natasha found him sitting on the porch, rain clouds gathering overhead. He was staring at the horizon as if searching for something he'd lost. "Talk to me," she said quietly. He didn't turn. "You've got a whole world waiting for you in the city. Investors, speeches, people who see you as you deserve to be seen. You shouldn't be here wasting time with me." Her voice broke. "Wasting time." He flinched at her tone but went on. "You deserve a man who wears suits, not grease. Who can buy you champagne, not fix your roof." "I don't care about any of that," she whispered. He laughed softly, a bitter, aching sound. "You say that now. But one day you'll wake up and wonder how you ended up with a man who's more broken than the cars he works on." Charles stopped. But he didn't. "I've seen your life, Natasha. I've seen the kind of people you walk beside, polished, perfect, untouchable. You may not see it, but I do. I don't belong in your world." She took a step forward, voice trembling. "You think I care about the world? I care about you. The man who still saves earthworms after it rains. The man who stayed up all night to fix my mother's old clock because he knew it mattered to me." He closed his eyes, jaw tight. "You deserve more than memories, Natasha." The first drops of rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, tapping against the porch roof, soaking the wooden steps. Natasha moved closer, her heart pounding. "You don't have to become anyone else to be enough. You already are. You always were." Her voice broke tears, mingling with rain. "All I ever wanted was the boy who held my hand when the world fell apart. You don't have to be rich or powerful or anyone's idea of perfect. You just have to be him." Charles finally turned, eyes shining with everything he couldn't say. "And what if I can't be that anymore?" "You can," she said fiercely, "because you already are." He took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry. Don't you dare." But before she could finish, he stepped back, one foot off the porch, then another. The rain blurred his face, softened the edges of the moment. "Take care of Rosie," he said quietly, "and take care of yourself." Then he walked away, not running, not slamming doors, just walking slow and steady into the downpour. Natasha stood there long after he disappeared down the street. The rain soaked her dress, her hair clinging to her face. She didn't care. The house behind her glowed with soft lamplight, warm, alive, but she felt only the cold. Inside, Rosie stirred, calling faintly in her sleep. Natasha rushed to her, brushing curls from her forehead, whispering that everything was fine. But when she sat alone again, the truth sank in. He hadn't left in anger. He'd left in love, the kind of love that convinces itself the other person will be happier without you. She pressed her palms to her eyes, her breath trembling. How cruel it was. She thought that the kindest hearts were always the first to believe they weren't enough. Days passed. The house grew quiet again. Too quiet. The coffee pot stayed untouched. The laughter in the garden faded. Rosie asked questions Natasha didn't know how to answer. Everywhere she turned, she saw traces of him. His toolbox by the shed, his jacket draped over a chair, the wild daisies he'd tied back by hand. One evening, as twilight painted the sky, she found herself kneeling in the garden. The flowers he'd tended swayed gently in the breeze. She brushed her fingers over the petals, whispering, "You fixed everything, Charles. Everything but the one thing that mattered most." The wind stirred as if answering, carrying the faint scent of rain. Natasha closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she prayed not for success, not for strength, but for the courage to believe that love could still find its way back through the storm. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, their golden light casting reflections across marble floors and crystal glasses. Every surface gleamed with wealth, every smile rehearsed. It was the annual charity gala hosted by the family who had adopted Natasha years ago. The people who had given her opportunity and in return expected perfection. She had attended every year since becoming CEO, but this time she felt like a stranger in her own name. The evening unfolded like clockwork, polite laughter, champagne flutes, the usual questions about mergers and markets. But under the music, whispers followed her like shadows. "She hasn't worn her engagement ring. I heard she's been seen with a mechanic. Disgraceful after all they've done for her." Natasha kept her composure, her smile poised, like glass, fragile, polished, dangerous. Then her adoptive father approached, wine swirling in his crystal glass, his voice sharp beneath the charm. "So," he said, "it's true then. You've been seen around town with that man, the one from the garage." Conversation around them faltered. A dozen curious eyes turned their way. Her stepmother's voice followed, colder than the ice in her drink. "After everything we built for you, the education, the company, the reputation, you'd throw it all away for someone like him." The orchestra kept playing softly, but the melody sounded distant, hollow. Natasha set her glass down, fingers trembling only slightly. "Someone like him," she repeated quietly. Her father's brow arched. "You know what I mean. A man like that has nothing to offer you. No influence, no wealth, no future. You'll ruin everything you've worked for." For a moment she said nothing. Then she rose from her chair. The movement silenced the entire table. When she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, defiant, and heartbreakingly sincere. "I'm not throwing anything away," she said. "I'm finally choosing something that's real." Gasps rippled through the room. Her father's face reddened. "Real," he hissed. "What's real about poverty, about shame? You think love can feed you. You think it will last. When your world collapses," Natasha met his gaze, unflinching. "Love doesn't need to feed me. It teaches me how to live. And I would rather be poor and honest than rich and empty." Her mother's voice trembled with anger. Don't be foolish, Natasha. The world doesn't reward sentimentality. No, Natasha said softly, but it punishes cowardice. And I've been a coward long enough. She stepped back from the table, her silk gown brushing against the floor, her chin lifted high. You taught me how to succeed, she said. But he taught me how to be kind. And between the two, I know which one I'd rather keep. And with that, she turned and walked away, out of the golden hall, past the murmuring crowd, past the life she had spent a decade building. Outside, the sky had opened up, rain pouring in silver sheets across the city. She didn't call for a driver. She didn't grab an umbrella. Barefoot, heels in hand, she walked through the storm, each step pounding against the pavement like a heartbeat. Water soaked through her dress, clung to her skin, tangled in her curls. But she didn't stop. Streetlights blurred in the rain, and the wind whipped against her face. But she kept going past rows of glittering windows, past the world that had always told her who she should be. By the time she reached the small apartment complex on Lincoln Street, she was trembling, breathless, and alive. She climbed the narrow stairs, water dripping from her hands, and knocked. Once, twice. The door opened. Charles stood there barefoot in a gray t-shirt, eyes wide in disbelief. He froze, staring at her, the woman who had once belonged to another world, now standing drenched and shivering at his door. Natasha. His voice cracked. What are you doing here? She stepped closer, raindrops sliding down her cheeks like tears. I had to see you. He shook his head, confused. Why? After everything I said? Because you were wrong, she interrupted. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. You said you weren't enough, but you're everything I ever wanted, and I'm done pretending that I need anything more than you. Natasha, don't. No. She took another step, her hand finding his chest, the rhythm of his heartbeat against her palm. I don't need a crown. I don't need titles or applause. I need you. You are my home. For a long moment, neither moved. The sound of the rain filled the silence between them. Then Charles reached out slowly, as though afraid she might vanish, and brushed a wet curl from her face. You shouldn't have come here like this, he whispered, though his voice shook. You'll catch cold. I already did, she said softly. The night you walked away. His breath hitched. He closed his eyes, fighting the storm behind them. I'm not good enough for you, he said again weakly. She shook her head. Stop saying that. You're the only person who ever saw me for who I am, not the name, not the title, just me. He swallowed hard. You don't know what you're giving up. Yes, she whispered. I do. I'm giving up everything that never truly mattered. She stood on her toes and pressed her forehead to his. And I'm choosing everything that does. The thunder rumbled outside as if answering her. The room was dim, one flickering lamp, the soft hum of the rain. Charles's arms slowly wrapped around her, pulling her close, as though afraid she'd disappear if he blinked. He kissed her forehead, hesitant at first, then sure, then desperate, like someone who had finally stopped running. The world outside their small, imperfect shelter faded away. There was only the sound of the storm, and the two of them standing still in its eye. When they finally broke apart, Charles's voice was barely a whisper. What happens now? Natasha smiled through her tears. Now we start over, together. And in that quiet apartment with the city rain falling against the glass, two people who had spent years trying to be perfect finally allowed themselves to be human. It was messy, it was uncertain, but it was real. And for the first time in a decade, that was enough. It began with a headline: Millionaire CEO in secret romance with struggling mechanic media empire at risk. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Tabloids ran with it. Social media erupted. Investors panicked. Commentators debated her morality, her judgment, her sanity. Photos of Natasha leaving Charles's apartment, taken from across the street in the rain, were splashed across every major outlet. By morning, her phone was a war zone. Messages, missed calls, demands for comment. Her assistant's voice on the other end of the line trembled. Natasha, the board wants an emergency meeting. They're not pleased. Natasha sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of untouched coffee. The television in the corner flickered with her own face smiling in a photo taken at a charity event, beside a cruel headline she didn't recognize herself in. Charles appeared in the doorway, worry etched deep on his face. "You saw it?" She nodded. "Everyone has." He came closer, lowering his voice. "Say the word and I'll handle it. I'll tell them it's all lies. That I made it up." Her eyes lifted to his. "You'd let them think you're a liar to protect me. I'd let them think anything if it kept you safe." Her hand reached across the table, fingers finding his. "That's exactly why I won't let you." By noon, the situation had worsened. Media's stock dropped 12%. Sponsors withdrew. A board member resigned publicly, calling for a restoration of professionalism. Her inbox filled with statements drafted by the legal team, denials, half-truths, strategies for damage control. Each one read the same: distance yourself from him. She stared at the screen for a long time before closing her laptop. When her assistant knocked softly and said, "They're waiting for you downstairs," Natasha stood, smoothed her blazer, and walked toward the door. Her reflection in the elevator glass looked foreign, not the poised CEO the world knew, but a woman caught between two lives, the one built on ambition and the one built on love. When the doors opened, the boardroom was already buzzing. 12 faces turned toward her, some anxious, some cold, some quietly furious. Cameras were not yet present, but she could feel the invisible weight of every opinion pressing down. Griffin. One of the senior executives began tone-clipped. "We all respect your personal freedom, but your actions have placed the company in jeopardy." "Jeopardy," Natasha echoed softly. "For loving someone." "This isn't about love," another board member snapped. "It's about credibility. You are the public face of a billion-dollar brand. You can't afford humanity," she interrupted gently. "Can't afford honesty." A murmur rippled through the room. "Natasha," said an older man, her longtime mentor voice weary, "we built this company on your image, your discipline, your professionalism. You can't just throw it all away." Her gaze softened. Then maybe it wasn't built on the right things. Later that afternoon, she stepped onto the stage of the Media press hall. Flashes burst in a storm of light. Dozens of cameras, hundreds of eyes. The murmur of reporters filled the air. Behind the podium, Natasha adjusted the microphone. Her palms were steady. Her heartbeat wasn't. "Good afternoon." She began, her voice calm and clear. "I know why you're here." A hush fell. "For the past decade, my life has been public property. Every success celebrated, every mistake magnified. I built a company I believed in. I worked hard to honor the name you gave me." She paused, eyes glancing briefly at the journalists, scribbling notes, then back to the sea of cameras. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that life is not just about headlines or balance sheets. It's about being true to others and to yourself." Her voice grew quieter, but firmer. "I have nothing to hide. I am in love with a man who works with his hands, who fixes broken things, who taught me that kindness is not weakness." And no, I am not ashamed." The room buzzed. Reporters leaned forward. Someone shouted, "Are you admitting to the relationship, Ms. Griffin?" She said simply. "I am, and I am not ashamed of love. I would only be ashamed if I pretended not to have a heart." The silence that followed was electric. When she continued, her tone changed softer, but resolute. "I understand what this means for my career, for this company, for those who trusted me. But I will not apologize for being human." She looked down at the prepared statement in front of her, the one her lawyers had written. Then deliberately she folded it in half and set it aside. Effective immediately, she said, "I am resigning as CEO of Row Media, not out of defeat, but out of choice. I built this empire to tell stories about truth. Today I'm finally living one." A stunned silence swept the room. She took a slow breath, her composure unwavering. "To those who believed in me, thank you. To those who doubt me, I understand. But this chapter ends here. The next one begins on my terms." And then, with a final steady nod, she stepped back from the podium. The flash of cameras was relentless. But she didn't flinch. Outside, the air was cool and clean after the storm. Charles and Rosie were waiting in the car parked by the curb. Rosie waved from the back seat, clutching her stuffed bear. "Mommy Natasha," she called out. Natasha's heart swelled at the sound of it. She opened the door, slipping into the passenger seat. Charles looked at her eyes full of both pride and fear. "Are you sure about this?" She smiled faintly. "I've never been surer." He exhaled, hand reaching for hers. "Where to?" Natasha leaned back, glancing one last time at the towering glass building behind them. Her former kingdom, now just another part of the skyline. "Anywhere but here," she said softly. "Someplace quiet, someplace real." The engine started. The city lights faded behind them as they drove out into the dusk, a small family leaving behind a world that had mistaken wealth for worth. And though Natasha didn't know what waited ahead, she knew what she'd gained. Freedom, truth, love that didn't need to be defended. A year later, the city felt like a distant dream. Where once there had been glass towers and flashing cameras, there were now rolling fields, slow mornings, and skies painted in shades of peace. On the outskirts of a quiet little town stood a wooden cottage with a hand-carved sign above its door, "Second Chance Cafe." The paint was slightly uneven, the porch creaked when you stepped on it, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifted down the road every morning. It wasn't perfect, and that was exactly what made it beautiful. Natasha stood behind the counter, her curls tied back loosely, an apron dusted with flour around her waist. She poured coffee into a mug, the sound mingling with the gentle hum of jazz from an old radio. Her laughter light and genuine carried through the warm space. Rosie sat on a stool nearby, her legs swinging, concentrating hard on drawing flowers onto napkins. Charles was by the window, fixing a wobbly chair sawdust, clinging to his forearms. "Don't make it too straight," Natasha teased. "Our customers love how authentic the place looks." Charles chuckled. "Authentic, huh? That's one word for crooked." She grinned. "It's called charm." When they first moved there, the locals had been curious, a glamorous woman from the city, and the man everyone said she'd given up her empire for. But soon, curiosity turned to affection. Natasha's baking became the talk of the town. Charles offered free coffee refills to farmers who came in tired from the fields. Rosie, now 5, had appointed herself the cafe's chief of happiness, handing out wildflowers to anyone who looked lonely. The cafe became more than a business. It became a small sanctuary for travelers passing through, for neighbors seeking comfort, and for a little family who had rebuilt themselves from love and humility. On a rainy afternoon in early spring, the cafe glowed warm against the gray sky. The air outside smelled of wet grass and earth. Inside, a small group of regulars lingered over pie and coffee. Rosie hummed a tune as she arranged tiny daisies in jars. Charles stood by the window gazing out at the rain. His hands were steady, his heart calm. Natasha walked over, handing him a towel. "You've been staring out there forever," she said softly. He smiled without turning. "Just thinking how far we've come." "You miss the city?" He shook his head. "I don't miss where we were. I just wish I could tell the man I used to be that he didn't have to be afraid." Natasha's eyes softened. He learned it eventually. Charles turned to her, then eyes gentle, deep with memory. The cafe door creaked as the last customers left, the bell chiming softly. Rosie locked it with a proud little twist of the key, then skipped upstairs to her room with her stuffed bear. The world outside was silver and still. Natasha wiped her hands on her apron and turned back toward the counter, only to stop short. Charles was standing in the center of the room holding something small in his hand. It took her a moment to realize what she was seeing. He was kneeling right there on the wooden floor, surrounded by the scent of coffee and rain. The old radio played softly in the background, a love song from another time. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, hair slightly damp, and his smile trembled with emotion. "Charles," she breathed, her hand covering her mouth. He looked up at her, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that carried years of silence and all the words left unsaid. "A year ago, you gave me something I never thought I'd have, again a second chance to love, to live, to believe that I was enough." He took a slow breath. "I can't promise you riches. I can't promise a life without storms. But I can promise that I'll never walk away again. I'll fix what breaks, build what we need, and love you the way you've always deserved to be loved." His eyes glistened. "So, Natasha Griffin, will you let me be the man who never stops choosing you? Will you marry me?" For a long, trembling moment, she said nothing. Her hands shook as tears filled her eyes. Then she nodded once, twice, then over and over again. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking into a smile. "Yes, Charles, 1,000 times yes." At that exact moment, Rosie came running down the stairs, holding a basket of flower petals she had been saving from the garden. "Did she say yes?" she cried out. Natasha laughed through her tears. "She did." Rosie squealed and tossed the petals into the air, the soft pink and white flakes landing in her mother's hair. "Mommy said yes," she shouted. Charles pulled them both into his arms. His 2 reasons for breathing, his 2 miracles. Outside, the rain began to lighten, and a single ray of sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the sign outside Second Chance Cafe. That evening after closing, they sat together by the fireplace. The flames flickered gently, throwing warmth across the walls. Rosie slept between them, curled beneath a knitted blanket. Natasha leaned against Charles's shoulder. On the wall above the mantel hung a wooden plaque Charles had carved himself. She looked up at it, smiling softly. "Love doesn't ask for perfect, only the courage to try again." Her voice was barely a whisper. "You really believe that?" Charles brushed his thumb across her hand. "I do now." She looked down at Rosie, sleeping peacefully between them. "So do I." The fire crackled. The world outside was quiet. And in that stillness, love once broken, once lost, found its forever home. Love doesn't care about titles, class, or time. It doesn't fade with years or distance. It waits patiently, quietly for 2 hearts brave enough to believe again. So, if you've ever wondered whether it's too late to start over, let this be your reminder. It's never too late to choose love. Never too late for a second chance.